My father now booked passage to come to the United States on the French quota because he had been born in the Alsace. The French were allowing him to be considered as a Frenchman. So he was able to book passage on the French quota to come to the United States. And a day or two before they were supposed to leave, they'd already sent trunks ahead to Holland with clothing and some silver. I mean, this is, an interesting, story of survival in that sense. The superintendent of the building that my father owned came to him and said, "You are going to be denounced to the Gestapo." In the middle of the night, they fled. They got to the Dutch border. The Dutch looked in my father's passport, which is full of stamps of travel, Germany, England, Israel, in and out of the country, no restrictions. And they said, "You're missing a stamp." Now you can see it has the J stamped in it for Juden. He probably had to wear a yellow star. But I know that it was May 11th they got to the Dutch border because I have my mother's passport. As I said, my mother kept everything. And in here is the Dutch border stamp, May 11th, 1939. Because the Dutch believed that my father's missing stamp, they held my mother hostage. They sent my father back into Germany. He collected the appropriate stamps that came to the United States. And in here, of course, is the visa, the all-important golden visa that allowed someone to come to the United States. Without this visa, people perished. This is the story of Otto Frank and Anne Frank. He tried to get this little piece of paper. The difference between life and death. My father reaches the United States, my mother and father. There's no Ellis Island anymore. The boat docks in Brooklyn. They settle in Brooklyn for days. I don't know, they find a place to live. And they have no employment. So the Jewish community says, "We will find you a place to work, but not in New York because there's too many people looking for jobs." It's the end of the Depression. So they wind up in Clarendon, Pennsylvania, and there's no jobs. And the Jewish community says, "We'll give you charity." My father says, "I don't want charity." I have letters that he writes back to the Jewish agency in New York saying, "You told me to be a job. I just want to work. I don't want charity." My father begins to drive a Pepsi-Cola truck. He'd never done any physical labor in his life. And then he decides to go into the metals business because he knew that from his youth. And he was always moving towards larger cities. They moved to Buffalo. And he gets drafted. And this is before Pearl Harbor. And they call him up and they say, "You're 4F. And he says, "Why?" He says, they say to him, "You have an enlarged heart and diabetes." My father was 31 years of age. So he couldn't even serve in the military. But he was teaching himself to read English learn English by reading the New York Times. And he reads that under Lend-Lease we are sending tanks and howitzers into Russia. And in the freezing cold, when you expelled a shell from a howitzer or a tank, the barrel would heat up and then would cool down. And that expansion and contraction would cause the barrels to crack. So my father came up with the idea of alloying aluminum with the steel used in the barrels. And he was able to convince the steel manufacturers, I don't know how he did that, to use what he called anti-piping compound. It's my belief that he received a letter from the government commending him on that contribution to the war effort. I don't have it, but I do know I have a letter from 1948 where someone's asking to buy anti-piping compound from him. By 1951, my father's very successfully moved to Cleveland. Actually moved to Cleveland and my father was struggling because the country was expanding and the great steel, auto, rubber axis basically was Detroit, Cleveland, Akron, and Pittsburgh. So they moved from Buffalo to Cleveland. And he was struggling. And then there was a miracle. My father and my mother were very close. And one day they were driving around in Cleveland. And my father was just talking business. My mother said, Well, how about Apex? Apex was the name of an aluminum company there. And she meant to say something else, but he said, that's it. They are dumping their dross or the skim from when they melt the aluminum on the dumps. And he started to collect that dross, refine it, built his own very large ball mills, these big, large containers like a concrete truck where they crushed the aluminum and dross, and then he'd melt it and skim off the real dross and sell that aluminum back to the aluminum companies for alloying. And that was the beginning of my father's success in the United States. And he became very successful very quickly. So within 10 years or 12 years of being in, let's say 13 years of being in concentration camp, my father was had contributed in 3 or 4 years to the destruction of the Nazis with his anti-piping compound. That's within 3 years of being in concentration camp. And within 12 or 13 years, he was an American success story. So my father was very much a Zionist. So by 1951, he was already contributing significantly to the State of Israel and to the History Do, which is the socialist organization. And here is a contribution of $15,000. $15,000 in 1951 is a very significant amount of money. So from the get-go, he was a Zionist. I was raised a Zionist. I was the only Jewish person in my neighborhood on the west side of Cleveland. My father wanted to be near his factory. And I was called Christ Killer. I went through everything. But on the other hand, I'd play ball 9 months of the year, except when the snow was on the ground, baseball, football, basketball, with all the kids in the neighborhood. It was a very interesting situation. But it made me very, very, feel very separate. The other, the classical other. At the same time, when you stop to think about it, I was born in 1944. When I was 10 years old, 1954, the war had only been passed 9 years. The concentration only liberated 9 years. The state was only 6 years old. I first was taken to Israel in 1955 to meet my grandmother. And since then, I've been there more than 50 times. Not every year, but I've been making up for it. And I am a very, very lucky person. I had fabulous parents. They left me with so much. And whatever I do now is to honor them and to do my bit to perpetuate the Jewish people in the State of Israel.